If you know any working parents, you know that childcare is tremendously expensive. It often costs 4 figures per month per kid. The question that I've talked about with a number of people over the years is, why is childcare so expensive, yet childcare providers make so little money in wages? I'm really pleased to introduce Liz Pettit, who works in early childhood policy and practice. And Liz, is Kelly joining us?
She is not able to, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we've got Liz, and she can speak to a number of the issues that providers also face, because this is something that you think about and work in every day. So without further ado, glad to turn it over to Liz, and she's got a little presentation, and then we can kind of open it up for whatever discussion in just a few minutes.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Nathan. So I'm Liz Pettit. Actually, I think I recognize Gail's name from Ready Kids, if you're on, Gail. Well, that's pretty cool. So awesome. I know you have lots of expertise in this subject. So please feel free to interject at any point. I have some slides to share just to kind of frame the conversation, but I think largely we can talk a lot more at the local level. And I don't know, folks on the line, by a show of either the reaction hand or on video, if you work in childcare or have experience with using childcare. Kelsey, it looks like you might raise your hand.
Not, which is why I have my 5-month-old on the thing.
Yes, cool. Okay, great. Yeah, so, I think it's an issue that is close to people's heart when they're experiencing it. And then maybe sometimes goes to the back of their mind once they don't need childcare anymore. So that's kind of one of the challenges we have. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll share a few slides and just kind of key ideas. And then we can open it up for discussion and maybe some brainstorming or thinking about what you guys care about and what you might want to do about this. Can folks see my screen? Cool. Okay, well, I have used 2 words to describe the current state of childcare. I think this applied before COVID, and it is even more true now that we're in the middle of COVID. The current way that we do childcare in the US is not sustainable for families, and it's not sustainable for childcare providers. And so we are really in a state of crisis, and we have been for a while. COVID has just exposed that. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of data that kind of helps underline that fact. But before we do that, just quickly, why should you care about this issue? I'm guessing because you're on here, you already do care about this issue. But if you need a little reminder, the thing that I find really compelling is this idea that children's brains are really built in the first 3 years of their life. Which, as a parent, I have a toddler. That's a lot of pressure on those first 3 years, but it really is true. So if children are not given warm and supporting relationships, if they're not having conversations and hearing words from their caregiver, they're really missing out on those brain building experiences, and it really shapes the rest of their life. So there's tons of research showing that 3rd grade reading skills, kindergarten readiness, life outcomes are all connected to experiences that happen in these first 3 years. And so it's not simply putting a kid in care so that you can go to work. It's really giving them access to experiences that set the tone for the rest of their lives. So this is much bigger than just parents needing care for their kids. This is really about building the next generation of children and adults in our society. So quickly, this is the average cost of care across the US in different states for a family. This is infant care costs. And you see a pretty wide range. But in Virginia, it's about $10,000 a year per family. In Charlottesville, I know it's higher than that. I know in Arlington, Northern Virginia area, it's much higher than that. That's a ton of money for most families. I think it's somewhere around 50% of income for a single parent household at the median income level. So when you have a kid, it's something that's really hard to plan for as a parent. I know I knew everything about it, and I still was like blindsided by the fact that I was going to be paying this much money every year. But we all want what's best for our kids, so we end up paying whatever we have to make it happen, or we end up quitting our jobs to be able to take care of our kids. Why is it so expensive? There's a few different reasons, and there's a video I can send you all that really explains this well. But basically, for very young children, you need to have a lot of adults to take care of kids. You can't have 12 infants in a classroom with one teacher. That's not safe. It's not good for the kid. They need their diapers changed. They need naps. They need, interaction and being held. So there's typically pretty low ratios in terms of the number of kids who can be with one adult. And so simply having an adult costs a lot of money because that is a person's time and energy. So that ratio requirement makes care pretty expensive for parents. The other problem is that from a public policy perspective in the US, we do not invest hardly any money in our early care and education system. So where the red arrow is, that's us on a list of, many of the developed countries in the world. We do not spend hardly any money from a public funding perspective on providing early care for parents. And so almost all of the cost burden ends up falling on families directly. And yet on the flip side, the providers who are actually caring for our children, who are nurturing them, building their brains, are making on average $10 an hour, which is less than you make sorting Amazon deliveries. It's less than you make in a lot of much lower skilled employment areas. And this just makes me super angry. I don't know how you guys feel about it. It seems completely unfair to me. And as a result, largely of these low wages, we have a really high turnover of teachers in early child care. So if you have sent your kid to a child care center, chances are they've had multiple different teachers throughout their experience, which is disruptive for kids and for adults in terms of forming those bonds and trusting relationships that are necessary in childcare. The other really shocking statistic, I think, is that 50% of folks who work in childcare centers are on some form of public assistance because they are paid so little. And then as soon as you get up to kindergarten, wages go up significantly, which is good, but we all know that K-12 teachers also don't make enough money. But that actually ends up causing a lot of childcare teachers to leave infant, toddler, and younger kid care to go up to pre-kindergarten or kindergarten because they can make more money. And so our children, our youngest children, are kind of left with the lowest skilled workforce and teachers with the lowest pay, who then in turn are under a lot of stress because they are not getting a living wage. So it's sort of a compounding problem. It's expensive for parents. The teachers themselves are not seeing a lot of that money because of all of the other expenses that go into taking care of kids. And so it just keeps, that cycle keeps going. Who does this impact the most? I think it impacts the kids the most. There's almost 15,000 kids in Albemarle County who have both parents in the workforce, and therefore we can assume need care. So that's 15,000 who are under 6 years old, and one or both of their parents, whoever they have, is in the workforce, and so they definitely need care. That's a very large number of kids. It really impacts women and women of color, especially during COVID. We've seen a huge, basically women have left the workforce because they tend to be a lower wage earner, and when push comes to shove, they have to make the decision of staying home with their kids or continuing with their job. And they end up having to quit their job and stay home. It really, really impacts women of color who tend to hold many of our caregiving jobs that are low wage. And so the fact that we continue to pay them less than they are worth just compounds this problem. It also really impacts dual income households. So anyone where both parents are in the workforce, or if it's a single parent household, you know, that parent is working. They're often having to make choices about whether they continue with their career, or whether they continue working, or whether they have to stay home with their child because they can't find care or they can't afford care. And then finally, the group that I think gets left out of this discussion the most are unpaid caregivers, which I'm sure all of us have relied on heavily. That is your mom who retired early so that she could care for your kid because you couldn't afford to send them to childcare. That is your neighbor who offers care for free so that you can work. These tend to be people who do not have generational wealth. Especially women of color. They tend to be folks within your family who don't have generational wealth. And the fact that they give their free labor to basically uphold our society is really an injustice that goes unseen by many people. And that accounts for almost 50% of the kind of childcare that kids receive. So yes, thank God that my mom can come you know, randomly and take care of my kid when I need her to. But what is she giving up in order to be able to do that in terms of building her own wealth and stability as she ages? Those are the kind of things that we're having to make decisions about as families every day. Again, COVID and childcare, we have basically seen a mass exodus of women from the workforce as a result of this issue. There's tons of writing on this right now, so I encourage you to read some of the op-eds that are out there about it. Why is childcare largely ignored by politicians? These are mostly my personal theories, but I'm sure you guys have thoughts on this too. I think it's largely because it focuses around young kids. They don't have a voice of their own, obviously. It mostly impacts women and women of color, who we know are very low in terms of representation in government. And so their voices are just simply not being heard. And then the history of childcare. So in the past, especially in the South and Virginia in particular, women of color have been expected to provide childcare to our youngest kids and to basically raise them. This was, you know, when folks were enslaved, this was done and required. And then as folks were liberated, they were still expected to do this for almost no pay. And that basically, that trend has continued to this day. And so that history of systemic racism and systemic sexism is part of the reason that $10 an hour is all that folks are earning in this profession. And we have to admit that, I think, to ourselves in order to move forward. Do you guys have thoughts on why you think childcare is ignored by politicians? Anyone want to share? Yeah, Kelsey.
Well, I mean, I think there's no lobbying, right? Like the interests that get funded are the interests that are the most vocal. And I mean, it's not just that it's women of color primarily who are doing the care. It's that it's people who are so busy that they can't, you know, that they don't have the time or the resources or the power to sort of make it clear, you know, that it's a problem for people. And I mean, obviously, you know, babies aren't lobbying.
I love that you said that about time, because I think as a parent of a toddler, there is no time to cry out and say I'm drowning, right? Like, you just have to keep surviving. And I think that is totally true for everyone in this field.
And that's true with providers too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anyone else have thoughts?
It's also a class thing, right? The lawmakers making these decisions are probably comfortable enough to where they don't need it, and it's not something that Plus, I think what you've got on the screen, who are the lawmakers, or until very recently, it was almost all men, and it still is mostly men who come from a certain class background.
Liz, if you'll forgive me, I just had one other thing.
No, please, everyone, we have so few people. You guys can just unmute and talk.
Nathan made me think of this, but also part of it is oh gosh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Oh, it's because you hear a baby crying. It's natural.
Nope, lost it. Got to come back to it. Sorry.
Hi, I just turned on my camera. Sorry, I had been working out, so I'm all sweaty, so I apologize. I thought this was later. But I think, what I hear a lot, especially since I've come to Virginia, is that there's this strong religious lobby that says the government should not be involved in family life. And they consider birth through 5 this time where families are supposed to convey values and do things, and they do not want the government intruding into that process. So they don't want to fund, a lot of early childhood care. So I think there's that. I think there's also the question of who deserves to have childcare. And so, there are programs like the public preschools that are available. And I don't know if any of you have ever completed one of those applications, but the number of questions that they get asked, and they have to rip their hearts out and show, not only do I not have money, I'm a single parent, I didn't complete high school, I've been sexually abused, the father of the baby's in prison. Like, it's so, the whole tone of it is, you don't deserve this, we're giving this to you. I mean, I have very strong feelings too, Liz, so you're speaking my language, but I really do feel like there's this notion that, and you hear it all the time, we're an individualistic society, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you shouldn't have had that child if you weren't ready to pay for $14,000 a year for childcare. And I feel like if COVID has taught us anything, childcare is the engine for this society, and we're all connected. People can't work. They can't work those service jobs. We need people to do those service jobs, and their children should have childcare. So I think there's just so many strands of, that you cover under sexism and racism and enslavement. But I think, the passions run really high on this subject.
Yeah, thank you guys for sharing. It is a really big question of why this is ignored and how we change it. Well, I just have a couple more things to share, and then we can talk a little more maybe about what you guys think we can do at the local level. I'm based in Richmond, but I am from Charlottesville, and so I know the community pretty well, and I'm curious to hear what you guys are thinking from like a local, state, and federal perspective. So I think this question of what can we do, most of you probably already understand this, but prioritizing funding and programs at all levels is really important. One story I have is going to a city council listening session and asking, what programs are we going to offer for kids birth to 5 in the city of Richmond? And the response is largely, that's not really our thing. That's DSS, that's the state. We don't deal with that here in the city. We don't use city funding for that purpose. I don't even know how you would begin to go about doing that. And so I think we have to really push against some of those assumptions that have existed for a long time about where the money comes from, and start pushing for policies that actually address this at every single level. And then I think the other thing we can do is elect women. We know that women have experienced this firsthand much more often than anyone else. And when you elect them, they bring policies that have impacted them. So, if you look at both of the women running for governor right now have in their platforms have specific plans around childcare, because they both have experienced this firsthand, trying to go into the legislature with young children who they're nursing and not being able to find care for them, not being able to nurse. And so they bring those policies with them on a personal level. And so supporting those candidates is really important. I think on a big picture level, we really got to move towards unified funding. Part of the reason that I think childcare can stay below the surface is because we have a bajillion different sources of funding, and they're all overseen by different departments and different levels of government. And it's really easy to just get lost in that fray, and to point to somebody else as that's their responsibility. So the more we can move towards a unified funding model, the better. And then I think we need to keep in mind like a big long-term vision. My personal long-term vision is universal childcare. So every family has the money they need and the access to the quality of care that they want. So you can talk about being able to afford care, but can you afford care that really nurtures your child and gives them access to the environment that will, you know, give them the love and care and learning that they need? Those are two very different questions. And so there's a lot of different ideas about how you get there. One is from Elliot Haspel, who actually lives in Richmond, but he's sort of like a national policy wonk. And he has recently published a book talking about, you know, if we just gave every family with a kid under 5 $15,000 a year, they can use it however they want. If they stay home and take care of their kid, that's their pay, basically. If they want their kid to go to a center down the street, they can pay that center with that money directly. It takes out a lot of the middlemen that you were talking about, Gail, in terms of like, do you deserve this? Do you really need this? And it just gives folks access to the choices that they really deserve to have. So that's one idea that's out there. It's pretty radical. It's pretty big picture. But I think it's worth thinking about like what that long-term vision is and how we get there. And then thinking really, really local, I was thinking about what you guys can do as a committee. There's some really small steps that groups can take to make a difference. One is to offer childcare during meetings. Kelsey, hello, I see you. So that people who do have young children can actually participate in meaningful ways. I know I personally find I have a lot of trouble participating in any kind of advocacy or political organizing work because it often happens in the only hours that I get to spend with my child during the day. So being flexible and understanding that and providing options for people is really important. And then seeking out perspectives missing from the committee. So, you know, if you have meetings at 6 p.m., you're probably not going to get a lot of parents on the meetings. So how do you make sure you hear their voices, even if they're not able to participate live? That's important. And then obviously, anytime a candidate comes to speak to you guys, ask them what they're doing about childcare and about birth to 5. Just raising the question is an important way to get this on everybody's radar and show that it's important to you guys as a committee. So those are my sort of general ideas that I want to leave you guys with. But I am curious, I'm going to go back to this bigger picture question of what we can do and see if you guys have other ideas you'd like to share with the group.
So I had a thought. I don't know, can people hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. And that's just thinking about what childcare looks like. So when we talk about classism in childcare, oftentimes those, so the Head Start program, for example, has a home visiting component, or it did, I don't know if it still does. But when we think about like, what is the family's boundaries? Because when you're asking families to open their homes for professionals to enter their homes, that feels very invasive. And people who have resources are not inviting providers into their homes to assess their parenting, you know? Mm-hmm. So I just think that needs to be a component when we like think about what would a vision for childcare look like. Is that vision going to be classist at its core by saying that because people don't have resources, they need more supervision than do other people. Because that's the system that we currently have, which doesn't feel great for low-income families across the board.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Helen. And I think that is also sort of like, how do we center the folks who are in need of services and childcare, and hear what they want out of it. Because I think we have this problem when we talk about the quality of childcare as well. There's sort of these frameworks that have been put in place by people at universities, and they don't necessarily focus on the things that parents care about when they choose childcare for their kids. And I think there's just a missing piece there, right? Of like what we actually need as parents and what is being offered as the supposed solution that is best for us, you know?
Liz, it's interesting. And I appreciate you coming on and giving this presentation and sort of facilitating the conversation as well. The figure that Elliot, what was his last name again?
Haspel
Put out of suggesting just like a universal basic income model of just $15,000 per kid age 5 or under, to either spend on private child care or to sort of pay for at-home care, is really interesting. And I noticed, I just did a little quick back of the napkin math, just dividing the Albemarle County Schools total budget by the total number of students, and it's like $14,300 per pupil. So it's not a crazy figure. We just, as a state, as a society, have prioritized spending that amount per kid over age 5, but not under age 5. And I mean, the political will to come up with $74 million or whatever it would be in Albemarle County is a little bit of a big lift, but it is, I mean, when you kind of step back and think and say, well, we're already doing this for every other child that's over age 5, then maybe that's a new perspective to bring to it.
Well, one of the other things that we do for kids over age 5 that we don't do for kids under is, subsidized care in the county and in the city ends at 2:30. You know what I mean? And so for parents who work, that is just an impenetrable barrier, because what do you do after 2:30 or after 3 with your children? There's no transportation. They are not of an age to walk home in a lot of cases. I mean, it's that part's really tricky too. And we have after school care for older kids.
While we're at a little pause point, I wanted to, speaking of saying hi to politicians when you have a chance to, I want to introduce a school board member from the Rio District here in Albemarle County, who's on the call, joined us. Katrina Carlson is here. And Katrina is, have you officially announced, or you maybe gonna announce what's happening in the next election?
It's not a secret, I'll be running again, but I have not made the announcement.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of turn over the floor for a sec to Katrina to see if you had anything to share about your race coming up and about kind of the early childhood economics bit that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, I don't have much to share in way of my campaign. I didn't know you could put a video as your background. This is going to change things for me. Can we mute? I'm more interested. I actually really appreciate the topic that we're discussing. It's something that I've grappled with. I mean, my kids are in the other room playing a game right now. One of them just started kindergarten, and managing childcare over this past year has been a demoralizing experience, honestly. I mean, I'm paying a ton of money, and I don't even have care for all the times I need care. It's hard to even find it if you're willing to pay. So I appreciate the topic. I will say, in terms of things that can be done, something that people are making a push on right now. I think there was some kind of legislative change that was passed that is going to make it so that it is at least possible for local government to provide funding for after school care for preschool students, because Kelsey, you spoke to the fact that, you know, that 2:30 cutoff time is really hard to manage if you're a working parent. And we do have after school options for older children, but we don't for the younger. We've gotten quite a few emails to the school board about that issue. I did have a conversation with the superintendent about it, and I would say it's a nascent planning process. There's not even clarity around who would be funding what and how the revenue streams would be used. It's actually Board of Supervisors is who pays for preschool. We just have a deal that we provide our spaces for them to use free of charge. So in a way, we're paying for some of it, but it's on the radar. And then to Liz's point, something that I thought was interesting that you mentioned was the quality of care becomes a sticking point for conversations. We almost didn't pass or approve getting the Boys and Girls Club near Jack Jewett because there were concerns. And I don't know, right? I mean, people that I trust their opinion felt very strongly on either side of it, because the Boys and Girls Club is considered like a low income option, and it's not academic in nature, supposedly. But I was like, some parents want that. Like, I don't need my kid to do more school after school. I'd be happy if you went and like did basketball or whatever, you know, at squash. I think somebody who really likes squash in Albemarle is donating millions to that Boys and Girls Club. And so they have tons of squash courts. I'm like, I'd be all for that. Wear them out before they come home. But that was just interesting, an interesting part that is part of the debate too, because that actually had really strong opponents to us accepting, it's a public-private partnership, so we don't even have to pay for it. And you can get after school care for the whole school year for $35 a month. If it's Boys and Girls Club. And to me, that just seems like a no-brainer, but for some people, it was a very real question of, well, wait a minute, the ones who are staying in our schools are gonna get extra homework help and all these things. And I don't know if I'm adding anything useful here other than to say that you ladies are saying things that are true.
Katrina, I was actually wondering, since you do deal with the supervisors in terms of budget requests and all the rest, I mean, I realize, again, if we said like, hey, our request is that you add tens of millions of dollars to your budget for early childhood care and education, you know, I mean, you get laughed out of the room in all likelihood, but I mean, what would it take to have the supervisors sort of take on something like that?
You know, Nathan, I'm not exactly sure where they lie on it. I do know that at least two of them have formally served on the school board and are big proponents for children and advocacy on behalf of children. Matt, when I talked to Matt, when I first got the emails and I asked him, what he said is they are working out some way to incorporate it in the budget. But yeah, it's just too much in the beginning stage for me to say I'd say what the stage is right now, if anyone's interested, is email writing. It's striking a nerve is what I'd say. I think it's striking a nerve with people in the school system, because Matt is responding to the emails, but it's too early right now is basically what he said. Just know it's on the radar, but it's not happening this school year.
I mean, I think there's not enough after school care for K-5, let's say, you know, or K-8. I mean, you know, 7th, 8th graders still sometimes need supervision. So it's a chronic problem. Not including the 4-year-olds, you know, is a problem too, but there's not enough for anybody.
Yeah, and the Albemarle after school care program is waitlisted at several schools. It's actually reversed. It's the most popular in our Western feeder pattern, but it is waitlisted across the board. It used to be a system where if you logged on right away, which it opened at like 4 in the morning. I don't know if any of y'all have had experience with this. It was first come, first serve, and even at 4 in the morning, if you weren't lucky, you weren't going to get it. So we did move to a lottery system to try to make it a little bit more equitable. But that's really hard for parents to plan around if you're going to get selected from the lottery. But it's paid, it's self-funded program. So in a budget line item, up until this last budget cycle, which got not nixed, but thrown off because of COVID, but it's self-paying. So it's however many people pay in, they have their own budget. It's not appropriated from the school system. So that's one thing we could do. That's an avenue we could explore. With something we talked about last year is just providing more money into the program to allow more people to participate.
The cutoff is 200% AMI, right? Isn't it? To participate in preschool at all.
I had a hard time hearing that.
200% AMI.
Yeah, the cutoff is 200% of AMI, right?
I do not know.
Okay.
For EDEP, the after school at Albemarle, or
Yeah.
for preschool?
Well, for preschool, but also, I mean,
Okay.
For subsidized aftercare too, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was about to say there's no. I know that some of our preschool options you have to qualify on an income level. I was like, there's no income qualification, but you're talking about for amortizing or taking away the cost. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. So that's another option. I mean, I'm excited to listen to you guys talk, because I hadn't even really, it had kind of, we're just getting the budget presented to us right now. So we haven't discussed EDEP. So I'm glad this is a really timely conversation, because these are questions I can ask about what thinking have we done and how are we going to be expanding it? Because that was a big topic of conversation last year, that just the budget got cut. There were no new expenses that happened last year. So that'd be interesting. And then make it more affordable, because it's not incredibly affordable. What is it? It's like $200
for EDEP.
Yeah,
It's in that ballpark.
Something.
Yeah. It depends on how many days in the cycle. Yeah.
I mean, I feel childcare is just terrible. That's the gist of this. Because even the EDEP, when I got the email, I'm like, do I want to do that? Because then that's going to mean like changing this to try to get this and rearranging the pickups. And is it better to just try to stick? It's constant struggle.
I think there's some creative things being explored. It's starting to be talked about in Virginia, and other states have done it, where they talk about a shared services model, because the way it's structured is so inefficient. You have each, like talking about childcare centers, so not talking about the after school or the public preschool, but each center doing their own, there's a tremendous amount of paperwork that comes with if you participate in the food program, if you participate in the childcare subsidy program, billing, just regular tuition, child assessments, you're dealing with, all the staff, all the families, and each place is doing their own. And so when we talk about staff costs, in my experience, I work with many, many, many different childcare programs. The ones that provide the higher quality and are doing well have a director and an assistant director, or co-directors. They have enough funding to support a more administrative position that frees up the director to maybe pay more attention to quality and training and what you want, that kind of leadership, because you need that. And so the shared services model would be something where those programs were, maybe 5 programs or 10 programs had a service that they contracted with that handled all of that kind of work for everyone at a lower cost. You see what I'm saying? So that everybody's sort of sharing the staff person instead of having to have their own. And I mean, that's just like a tiny piece of the puzzle. But when you really start unpacking, how does this current funding model work? It's so different than the public schools. It's, one kid's tuition at a time, or one childcare subsidy at a time. And childcare subsidy doesn't pay on a day a child is absent. So that's a disincentive for people to, you can't run a program when if a child is sick, you're not going to get paid. You charge your private pay people for the whole month, but subsidy will only pay if the child is there. So the whole thing is so unbelievably skewed when you think that this is about children, like going back to Liz's very first slide and presentation about this is the lives of children and the future of our, workforce, our communities. So it's a very complex subject. And I often say, people think because it's little kids, there's something simple about it. There's nothing simple about it.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm struck by too, Gail, just to echo exactly what you were saying, is that, it's the future workers, the future kids in schools and all the rest, is that, so many of the achievement gap and opportunity gap issues that the school board and schools try to sort of like patch up after age 5 started well before that, right? And so if the opportunities are there, quality childcare is there from a much younger age, then there'd be less opportunity gap to deal with later on. I don't mean to laugh about it, but it's like, it just seems like an obvious thing in some respects. It's just cost money.
I think another thing, something that struck me about what you were saying, Gail, was the conversation. There's a lot of interest when you focus on like the outcome of what the children are going to get. So, I mean, I know United Way is doing a big push around funding preschool, getting kids into a program where they're learning. And I think for whatever reason, people feel icky talking about just like child care for the women who have the children, not for the children to gain skills, but like also we need childcare to be able to work, to be able to fulfill our own aspirations or whatever, and to provide for our families. And I don't know if that's a point worth making or something, but just listening to this, I'm thinking it's something you don't hear a lot. I know when we went into COVID and I've read great articles on both sides of it, but there was this fear of saying that in some ways school is childcare. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all, but like we have to have places to put our children so that we can live productive lives in society. And I'm curious if thinking about it that way would open up any additional avenues, because I do know that there's support around getting children into programs that help them learn to read, that help them. But just saying like, no, I need care so that I can go out and work a job and provide and pay rent so that we have a stable house. I don't know.
And I wanted to go ahead and open the floor. Again, the floor's pretty open, really, but just to make sure everybody, Kelsey, Helen, Patricia, anybody else who wanted to chime in, had an opportunity here in our last 10 minutes or so.
I mean, I think this all comes back to the thing that you said at the beginning, which is, why is there no political will to do this? And it's because you have to deal with this sort of default assumption that women's lives and priorities and careers and values should restructure when they have kids. Like it should actually, refocus to make the child your first priority, which is, just frankly like a devaluing of the worth of women that we see reflected in legislation all the time. So, Nathan, I know you don't probably want to speak to the politics of this, but if you did want to speak to what you think people could do to make sort of immediate policy change, and what kind of political pressure we can bring to bear, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. I mean, I'm not a candidate. I'm not elected in any office. I'm just the co-chair of the Democratic County Committee, where we recruit candidates and help them get elected. I do love having these conversations, though, because I'm a big old lefty, and I think we should tax the hell out of people and pay for great social services. But I mean, as far as specific policies, I'd actually turn it over to Liz, because I know she's thought a lot more and works in the field to know a lot more specifics about what kind of ask might be, early asks, what could we organize people around that might gain some traction? I realize it's different in every locality, but Albemarle and Charlottesville a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm sure Gail will have some ideas too, but I think a few groups that are really good to follow in this arena are so Childcare Aware Virginia. They can't advocate, but they are deeply involved with childcare providers across the state, and have a sort of policy agenda every year that you can follow and support. Another group that is great to follow is Voices for Virginia's Children. They're more traditional advocacy, and they have a list of priorities every year. So both of those organizations go very deep into the existing laws and make very specific pushes each year during the General Assembly. So if you just subscribe to their newsletters, I won't go into like each of their policies for this year, but you can see what they're pushing for. I know right now Voices for Virginia's Children is pushing a lot on mental health support. and funding that for childcare teachers who are really burdened right now. Kids are acting out more because COVID is putting stress on everyone. Teachers their hours have been cut or they've been furloughed. If they were only making $10 an hour, that literally just pushes them all the way deeper into poverty. So their mental health is also in jeopardy right now. So they're pushing for better funding to support mental health services for the folks who do care for our kids, which to me seems like a basic no-brainer, but here we are. So those are the kind of things that they work at a very specific legislative level to identify what those things are. And that goes way beyond my expertise on policy. But the other thing that you can really push for is reducing, and this I think should happen every single year in the General Assembly, is as much reduction in the requirements on subsidies, and that can happen at the federal and the state level. Some of those things Gail was talking about in terms of like having to prove, X, Y, Z, and 17 other things in order to get access to money. So pushing for reduction in that and an increase in the amount of money that's available per family. So the subsidies right now they barely scratch the surface. Providers need more subsidy money, and families need more subsidy money. The utilization of subsidies is really low because it's so hard to access that families just end up trying to find free care within their family, because it's just too hard to make use of that money. So reducing any burdens that exist in that process is really important. And that's right now, that's the Department of Social Services through the state. Gail, what else would you add in terms of specific policy things you think we can push right now?
Yeah, I think if you look on Voices, there's a couple of pieces of legislation. I think it might only be temporary, but they are talking about, making subsidy available to people with slightly higher incomes. So right now the cutoff is so low that it's not reaching, many people who are living in poverty. It might not be the most dire poverty, but so they're talking about, because of COVID, I think making subsidy more broadly available. And they're talking about, sorry, there were some other things. This sounds like a small thing, but the cost every time somebody gets hired at a child care center, they have to go through background checks. And we talked about the level of turnover. And so if somebody works at a child care center, they have to often pay for their own backward checks, or the provider has to pay for them. And then if they go to another child care center, those background checks no longer count. They have to go through it all over again. So there's some talk about portability, where those background checks would be able to be transported. And that's like the kind of technicality that just sounds little, but if you look on Voices, you can kind of see some of the little building blocks that they're talking about.
It's interesting, the gamut of ideas here, from portability of background checks to universal basic income for kids under 5. I mean, every little piece would help, right? But I still feel like that first slide where it's like crisis and unsustainable needs a lot more than, than some of the technocratic things, even though those would help.
Could I jump in?
Please do.
I'm a person from a long time ago. I stayed home with my children.
Mm-hmm.
Then I became a nursery school teacher. Then I became an early childhood representative for the Virginia Association for the Education of Young Children and the National Association. And my goal and my passion was to get child care centers accredited. And the thing is, you all are talking about a lot of important stuff, the basic thing is they're going to have good childcare. You have to pay the teachers. Early childhood, I mean, the childcare teachers, teachers in the public schools at whatever age aren't paid enough. But early childhood education teachers are just not, it's not valued. And we are, and if, you know, if mothers are going to work and feel that their children are getting a really good deal, we need to have a system that pays the teachers. It's just, you know, that's basic. Thank you for letting me talk.
Well, thank you, Helen, for sharing. I think you're absolutely right.
I do live in Rio, so I have a,
Great.
okay.
It's nice to see you, Helen. I'm glad you made it on the call.
And Helen, thank you for your years of service to raising young kids. That is just amazing work. And not easy work either.
Not easy, and it's my passion, and I think it's yours. I heard you at the beginning of the program, and I thought, oh boy, this is so great, so inspiring. Universal childcare. I would love it.
Sign you up, huh?
Sign me up, except I'm too old to be of any help. Sorry about that.
It's okay. You can call and ask for it.
Right. We'll fund the lawmakers. Helen, I think your comment is a good one to start to wrap things up on here this evening at our community talk, sponsored by Albemarle Dems in the Rio District. And I think, you know, this conversation does. What I'm struck by as we talk more is that it's beyond just, you know, kids, right? It's also about economic justice and about gender equity and about you know, sort of opportunity gap and addressing things of that nature. And there's so much that goes into it that is kind of wrapped up, and I think a lot of it really is a matter of needing some policy attention to make this something that can be sustainable and to have a healthy, thriving future for our kids and for the Commonwealth. So I appreciate all y'all coming on tonight, and I especially appreciate Liz, who works in this field of policy and practice around childcare. And just want to say thanks again and offer it up to Liz for any closing thoughts.
Thank you guys so much for joining, and this was an amazing discussion, and I can see everyone's passion for this issue, so I hope we can spread that beyond those of us who are directly impacted, and really move the needle. So don't give up, have a big vision. I think the fact that Helen likes the universal child care vision is good enough for me, so I'm going to keep pushing for that. So thank you guys for joining, and I hope you have a peaceful evening.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. And we'll be back with another talk at some point. Keep an eye on your emails and everything. And yeah, we'll talk comprehensive plan or something.
Thank you for hosting, Nathan.
What's that?
Thank you for hosting.
Oh yeah, sure. Glad to do it.